monsters, madness, and magic.
All right, folks, welcome to the Monsters, Madness, and Magic podcast. I'm your host, Justin, here with a quick word before we dive in. Now, in this episode, I chat with writer and editor Darrell Schweitzer about resurrecting weird tales, self-promotion tips for young authors, rare books, the inspiration behind his character, Sir Julian, Lovecraftian poetry, and more. As always, thank you all for listening out there, and without further ado, here you go. Okay, Mr. Schweitzer, why don't you just take us back in time? You're a youngster.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Are you a book reader, fort builder, troublemaker, or all of the above?
I can remember when dinosaurs ruled the earth. I can remember when people submitted stories in magazines on paper. Remember that? I can remember when the computers were these enormous godlike things you saw, mostly in the movies, that had two enormous wheels like eyes, and it was like an altar. You remember that? More to the point, I suppose. Well, relevant to fantastic fiction and so on. I went to enough conventions and met enough people and paid attention to my elders that even many of the people in this 19. Well, hold it up, Kelly. That's of Weird Tales, 1920s, from Centipede Press, the most elaborate book I'll ever be in until the second volume comes out. Many of these names are not just names. I met these people. I knew some of these people. I met Edmund Hamilton and interviewed him. I knew Frank Belknap Longmont well. He even told me he voted for me for a Nebula Award once. He also told me a few things that aren't in the books, like he described H.P. Lovecraft's ability to open a Coke bottle with his thumb. Like that. Just flip it on. Either Lovecraft was what he said was Lovecraft had a wonderful physical strength, despite what everybody would have you believe. Either that or Coke bottle lids were not on as tightly in the 1920s.
So when you were young, what was your introduction into Lovecraft's fiction? Do you remember the first story that you read?
Oh, well, yeah, actually, this is actually very strange. My introduction to Lovecraft, the first story I read would almost certainly have been in the vault, because in those, when you're young, you tend to think you have to drag books at the front. And I had obtained a copy of the Dunwich Horror and others from the Arkham House edition, and the way I found out about it was that I had gone to a meeting of the Philadelphia Science Fiction Society, which I joined when I was about 16, or 15 or 16, spring of 1968. And it was customary that sometimes members would bring in, for what is called the no fund, because they have no funds for this. They would basically, there were always giveaway books and giveaway magazines that somebody didn't want. Read, we got done with it, they brought it in the club and gave it away. And there was somebody gave me a copy of a magazine called Anubis, which today we'd call a small press magazine. Today they didn't really know what to call it. And Anubis was a distinctly Lovecraftian themed magazine. I mean, it even had, you can now look it up on eBay. Probably these issues are quite expensive nowadays, because I remember the final issue had an original Lon Bodie strip in it, and the one issue had an original Roger Zelazny story in it, and I submitted stories there too. And of course, mine didn't get published. There was even a alleged facsimile of a page of the Necronomicon in the middle of it. So therefore, I actually read a couple of imitations of Lovecraft before I read the real thing. But more tellingly, there were ads for Arkham House on the insides of the covers. And I think I persuaded my mother to get me the Dunwich Horror for Christmas. And so that would have been my introduction to Lovecraft.
Quite a gift.
Quite a gift. And of course, as we all well know, Lovecraft becomes a way of life. One of my later and more unlikely accomplishments in the Lovecraftian field is as choir leader for the Cthulhu prayer breakfasts at Necronomicon Providence. Been doing this for years now. So I wrote all the hymns. And so we all get up there in our eldritch black robes and so on, and we sing. They have a prayer breakfast, and it's a service, and there's several people preach and so on and that kind of thing. I can remember one year there was a schism, and they wanted to start a Yog-Sothoth cult on the grounds that Cthulhu had become cuddly, and they had their plush Cthulhus. Nobody's ever going to make Yog-Sothoth cuddly, but that's all behind us now. And
I'm glad you settled it.
yes, so this is the only, yes, it's the only convention where I've ever been complimented for my singing voice. And the reason is that I'm in front of the choir, and I'm not holding a mic, so they can actually hear me, and individually, and basically, well, I have a reasonably decent singing voice, and I can carry a tune in a bucket. I may be musically illiterate, but that's beside the point. You know, everybody knows the tune of Rock of Ages or something, and if you do it as crawling chaos come to me, you know, it all works out. And I even got I got my picture in the New Yorker for this.
Wow.
Yeah, if you Google the phrase "croissants with Cthulhu," you will find an article from the New Yorker's webpage. I don't think it was actually in the magazine itself, which covers a Cthulhu prayer breakfast. And at the head of the article, there's a photo of the choir, and there I am front and center. I'm not mentioning my name in the article, but I did get my picture in the New York.
That counts.
That counts. That counts. I can say I have appeared in the New Yorker. Kind of.
So, Darrell, you mentioned that your mom gave you the Lovecraft book. Would you say that either your parents or someone else in your family were artistically, creatively inclined? Do you think that's where your roots came from in terms of writing?
My mother was a painter. I don't think she understood fantastic literature very much. She said that when she was a little girl that her favorite writer was Edgar Allan Poe, but in later years I wondered that she had actually forgotten everything she'd learned from him. I don't think she really got it. I mean, the one thing she was convinced when I was a kid that horror movies were unwholesome. And I had a little brother who agreed with her. So he would rat on me when I tried to watch, say, Frankenstein or something when there was a babysitter. And as a result, I was I was a monster kid without the movies, which basically means I had to smuggle issues of Castle of Frankenstein, or these would be destroyed if they were found. And you know, but I did have some issues. I was somewhat exposed to Castle of Frankenstein, which was a much better magazine than Famous Monsters of Filmland. And so I knew about all this stuff. I even had a friend about the sixth grade who would meet me after school, and he would tell me the stories of the horror movies he'd seen at kiddie matinees that weekend. Not only was he a very good storyteller, but I began to understand after a while that he was making some of these up. He was describing, there is no such movie as The Chill of Dracula, for example. Now, admittedly, somehow my parents didn't mind if I had a little creature from the Black Lagoon figurine, and actually I still have my Aurora model kit Dracula figure assembled when I was about 12, and it's in perfect shape, complete with a little bat in the in the bush, the whole works. And but I didn't actually get to see any horror movies until I was about 16.
What was your first one?
The Horror of Dracula with Christopher Lee. It's a very good place to start, because many of the movies that I read about and things like Famous Monsters would be ridiculous by that, even by the time you're 16. I can remember they had a whole issue they had a cover story about a movie called The Flesh Eaters, which I've still never seen, but I understand it's absolutely ridiculous. It's like robot monster quality. And you know, but so basically, I obviously started with the right ones. Then I remember at a convention, I actually got to see the Carlo Frankenstein for the first time. It changed my life. I wanted to be a writer by then. About the first story I ever published, it's about it might be described as being about a Norman Bates type whose mother came back from the grave as a ghoul, and they lived happily ever after. This was actually published in Weird Book magazine, which is a very respectable title. Although I would say that I had submitted as a teenager. I had submitted lots of stories to Paul Ganley, who became sort of a mentor for me, and he was the one editor who actually tried to teach me something. and either he succeeded or I broke him down because he published this thing, and it's let us say not well. In retrospect, it's not good. The a couple issues later, I had something in his magazine that I'm actually not ashamed of. But let us say the quality of the magazine went up somewhat after that. Actually, I owe Paul Ganley a lot. He later became my one of my first book publishers. He published my first short story collection, Tom of Bedlam's Night Out, and a couple more. I still hustle his magazine. He is retired. He's 91 years old and he's retired. And somebody else is editing Weird Book, but I still write to Paul every once in a while and order back issues and sell them for him because he still has a basement full of them. um,
So you knew from a very early age that you wanted to be a writer. You
oh
said
yeah,
even as a teenager, you just had the itch.
I did have the itch, and I did, but I also understood that I was not going to be on the bestseller list right away. Sprague Camp once told me that he knew somebody who quit his job and said he was going to become a writer, but he was only going to write for the best magazines like the Atlantic and the New Yorker. My
I,
guess is that this man had to get another job in a few months.
I was going to say, how did that work out for him?
Well, Sprague was more practical. Yeah, I will mention, yes, while dropping names, Sprague de Camp was the one, let us say, golden age science fiction writer who I knew better than casually.
Hmm.
He was a friend. I was a friend of the family. Well, I think I last saw him when it was well after he'd moved to Texas. But anyway, I was over at the house, and at one point I was even hired to evaluate Sprague's book collection. As you might expect, it was very orderly and very neat. Although he did not believe in dust jacket protectors. I don't think that many people did in those days. And I can tell you that for all you think of Sprague as the author of Less Darkness Fall and so on, he was a big P.G. Wodehouse fan. There was a whole shelf of P.G. Wodehouse first editions. He was not a collector, but he obviously had just bought these books as they came out in the 30s or 40s, and there they were. And so his copies of Lovecraft were the originals. He had an Outsider, another is going to be on the Wall of Sleep.
Well, do you know what happened to all those books?
Well, after he died, I think they got sold off. A lot of them got sold off to a bookstore in Plano, Texas. Probably, well, he had two sons who were not idiots, and I'm sure they didn't exactly let him go into the trash. And some of the books were quite valuable. Some of them were, but they were just. This is actually a tip for book collectors. Just anybody, if you've just been accumulating books all your life, and you buy more, you have more than beat up paperbacks, and you take care of them. That is, so you don't let the jackets get ripped, and you don't let the paperback spines get bent, and you don't let the cat piss on them, and so on. If you take care of them, particularly if you go to the point of, say, putting the jackets in mylar protectors and so on, do that for about 30 years, and there are going to be books in your collection that are worth hundreds, if not thousands, just by the standard way these things work out. Yeah, I mean, I got a review copy of. I got a review copy of the Walker edition, the first American edition of Stanislaw Lem Solaris, when it came out, which would have been the early 70s. I have seen that book priced at $1,000.
Wow. Would you say that's the most rare book that you own personally?
No, certainly not. Because I actually have been actively a collector. So I can do better than what I got for review. I mean, admittedly, I got a review copy of Nine Princes in Amber when it came out. Who later had Roger Zelazny sign it. That would be worth about $5,000 today. I sold it in the middle 70s to somebody for, I think, $50. Now, but $50 now, mind you, would be the equivalent of about 150 today, because this is an era in which a new hardcover book, like a new novel, would cost $5.
Right.
It's got 10 times list price for a new hardcover novel nowadays. It's closer to 30. So we get 10 times list price 5 years later. You just got 130. Don't sell so hastily. Anyway, if you want to know what, it's probably the most valuable book I have. It might be a signed limited edition of Laura Dunstaney's The King of Elfland's Daughter, which I got through a piece of shocking insider trading. There was a dealer at a Hilltown, our local convention, who had this book for sale. He had it offered for $500. Have you ever even heard of Keith Roberts?
No, not off the top of my head, no.
Ever heard of a book called Pavan, which is one of the classic alternate histories?
I'm not familiar, no.
Well, anyway, Keith Roberts also wrote a book about a teenage witch called Anita, which for some reason became extremely rare. And I happen to know that my colleague George Sillers was going to reprint this in about a month. You know, he hadn't publicized it well, but there was an Alfred Press edition of Anita, which I had induced him to do, coming up in about a month. So I took my copy of the British hardcover and I offered it to this fellow who had the Dunsany, and basically we worked out a trade. One copy of Anita plus $100, and I got the $500 book. And of course, well, to this day, I later acquired the inventory of Owlswick Press, so I've got crates of copies of Anita now, which are actually much superior to that British edition.
So the trade worked out for you.
Yeah, well, it kind of worked out. I'm still selling them for $5 a piece. But a friend of mine was seeking a copy of the paperback, the Ace paperback. It was originally an Ace paperback. He was seeking a copy for 10 years. Mind you, this is a very modest paperback. And when he finally found one, somebody offered him $100, priced it at $100. And then I talked George Sillers into reprinting this book, and it didn't sell. And I busted them. So go figure. You know what's hot right now? I just astonished to discover Michael Shea.
Yes, I've been trying to find a decent copy of Nif the Lean, and you can't find one for less than $100.
That's right. And well, I'll tell you what I just did the other night. I was going through trying to dig out some book, and I found that I had a copy of the complete Nif, the Bain Omnibus. And well, but I realized that I also have the sign limited hardcover of Nif the Lean.
Wow, that's going to be worth a penny.
That's worth a getting. Anyway, I can't remember I can't now even remember the name of the publisher, it was a guy from the Oregon with the eye patch who published the book. I cannot remember. Anyway, he did a limited edition of Niflheim. And then of course the omnibus contains the second novel, Minds of Behemoth, which if you go searching on ABE books or something or whatever, you just cannot find one for any price. But a quick look now here's how you get one. A quick look at the Internet Speculative Fiction Database reveals, lo and behold, it was serialized in Tomorrow magazine, which was that magazine that Aldous Budrys edited. And there were 3 issues of Tomorrow magazine toward the end of the run. I have a set of those. So I realized I've got a limited edition of Niflheim, and I've got the serialization of Minds of Behemoth. And this is just a Bain paperback, which is, the insides of the covers are turning slightly brown because they use crappy cover stock. And I realized, I can sell this. Well, what I did, what you do, of course, is you look at everybody else's prices and undercut them by about 10%. I put it on eBay for $60. I got it within hours. But anyway, if you need a copy of the sequel to Niflheim, find those issues of Tomorrow magazine.
I'm certainly going to do that. The only reason I have the copy I have on the shelf is because my buddy was kind enough to let me borrow his, and I know he's going to be wanting it back soon.
I'm sure I've had copies that have gone through my hands before, but anyway, that's me as a book dealer. and Paragon of Virtue on eBay.
Yeah.
But one of the realities that you also learn about not being on the bestseller list all the time is that in today's world you have to hustle your own books. Certainly short story collections and the like. Unless you are super famous, no major trade publisher is going to publish a short story collection of yours. You better be Stephen King.
Yeah.
I remember when Tor Books published a Ted Chiang collection, and somebody at Tor said, "Well, that's our story collection for the decade." Anyway, so you're going to go to various small presses. Then the reality of this is that a lot of these small presses don't promote very well. And what you need to do is order up lots of copies at wholesale discount, take them to conventions and sell them. This is also very profitable because if you have a $15 book and you're getting if you're getting, say, a 10% royalty, you're getting $1.50 a book if the publisher sells one. You're getting $7.50 a book if you sell it.
Right.
That does add up.
Just while we're speaking on writing, Darrell, how has your process to writing a story shifted over the years, if at all? Like, are you a heavy outliner?
No, I'm
Do
not
you?
an outliner at all.
Okay.
Okay, the one thing that actually, I was of course trained to compose on typewriters. I've written whole novels on manual typewriting. I still have this habit of sometimes if I just start writing a story and it doesn't work, and this frequently happens, you read about 4 pages and you realize this isn't right. Well, basically what I will do is print it out, put it to one side, and then start typing again, maybe several days or weeks later. I won't go back into the file and change little words because that's not what you're doing at that point. It's like telling a joke twice. There's a momentum to it. It's a big difference between saying, "Hey, remember that joke I told you last night? The punchline should have been like this," as opposed to getting up there and performing the whole thing again. And you, of course, as you do this, you'll start to discover things you didn't know were really in there, and you'll start to improvise. So when I'm actually writing, I'm actually usually pretty fast. I confess I wrote the novel The Dragon House in 2 weeks. At one point, I wrote 2 chapters in a single sitting, which I can tell you feels great if nothing else. But then, of course, this was my attempt to be. Wait, do you have a copy of The Dragon House, Candy? No, he doesn't have one. We can't show it. I can't show you everything. Anyway, this was my attempt to be Harry Potter. It was. People have commented. Some of a lot of my stories do have young protagonists and so on. Somebody commented that one of my editors once commented, says, "Well, it sort of reads like YA anyway." So I actually just went whole hog and wrote a YA novel. I had agents trying to sell it for 10 years. And then I took it to one of my regular, default publishers, Wildside Press. And of course they published it. And of course, so now you see me at conventions hustling copies. I'll tell you one rule. Well, two rules about, let us say, low-end publishing. Rule number one, never pay to be published. Many of the people who call themselves indie writers or that kind of thing are basically vanity press writers. They're basically publishing themselves, and when you publish yourself, it has no more, self-publication has no more critical acumen than a Xerox machine. What you need to do is you need to find some small press publisher at the very minimum. This is the bare minimum, is who will publish it without charging you, even if it's a matter of even if you didn't get advance, as long as you didn't pay to be published, and also having a plausible imprint on the book helps a lot. So one of the things I do for Wildside Press, which usually doesn't, I think they probably paid Kenneth Lee in advance for something they didn't pay, or Anne McCaffrey in advance, but anyway, they didn't pay me one. And I don't blame them for this because Wildside Press enables me to publish backlist titles, short story collections, 2 poetry collections, books of my essays, books of my interviews, and other things that I don't think the big boys in New York would really want. The bare minimum is that, in essence, they do all the work, and I have this plausible imprint, a respectable imprint. And when I go to conventions and sell these books, I always bring along some other Wildside titles with kind of protective coloration. It's nice if they sell, but I don't really care, because I'll also have a row of Wildside titles by Anne McCaffrey and Robert E. Howard. They publish a lot of Robert E. Howard, and Kenneth Lee or whoever. And then if anybody asks, I'll say, look, I have the same publisher as Anne McCaffrey. It's kind of a protective coloration because whenever anybody, well, hey, I'll tell you something that happened to me once where I could tell the woman who did this knew exactly what she was doing. She picked up one of my books, my short story collection. It was actually one of the ones that Paul Ganley published, and I noted that she was looking at the copyright page, the acknowledgments, very carefully. And I said to her, "Oh, you're a pro." And she laughed, and we both understood exactly what I meant, which the translation of that is, she'd never heard of me, she'd never heard of a publisher. She was looking to see if the stories had been published in respectable places. You can look at that table of contents and say, well, this one's fantasy and science fiction, and this one's from Asimov, so on, or whatever. This one's from Weird Book. Or anyway, if the acknowledgments are to respectable places, then the experienced person knows this is professional quality work. Doesn't matter, I've never heard of the imprint. That's another bit of important protective coloration. Yeah. And the other bit of advice I'll give people is that if you actually do have to design your own book, for God's sake, pay attention to the way other books are designed. My friend and colleague Jason Van Hollander has a wonderful one-sentence course in book design, which is taken a book from a nice conservative firm like Knopf and copy it. That means know what a half title page is, know where the title page goes. I'm sure you've all seen amateur books where all the front matter is in the wrong order. And I can assure you, if you take that in a book, it's dead at that point. Nobody's going to read it because it's dead because they just know this is amateur work. It's got to look like a real book. And they take the copy it involves copy the typeface if you can too. Pick, say a Ballantine hardcover and look at the typeface, look where the title page is, look where the half title is, look where the acknowledgments are, note that the author bio is in the back, not in the front, and then get all these things right, and you're halfway home. You will plausibly deceive the customer. Of course, if the book is crap, they'll catch on.
Right.
Right? This is a way to get their attention. The plausible approach.
Darrell, before we continue with writing, I meant to ask you this question earlier because it's a question I like to ask everyone. And what scared you when you were a kid?
It was a very brief period in which I believe in ghosts, but not for very long. Unlike, I'm not sure, well, the usual things that the kids are afraid of. Unlike most people who went to Catholic schools, I did not come out of there traumatized and afraid of nuns. I actually got along with them rather well. I know Lee's wife, Diane, will tell you stories, but I think what I conclude is it must have been much harder for the girls. But no, I got along with him rather well, so I wasn't afraid of that. And I don't have any particular phobias.
Never scared of the dark?
Not particularly the dark. I wouldn't enjoy being on a ledge 100 feet up. Well, I was a very outdoorsy kid. That is, I know people who live in cities who've never been off the sidewalk, but I was definitely off the sidewalk. And because among other things, my older brother and I were moth collectors, butterfly and moth collectors as their kids. He later became a leading entomologist. This is, I think, one thing you will see in my writing is that I do know the woods. And one of the things you're afraid of in the woods is stepping on a yellow jacket nest.
Oh, yeah.
I would say you'll have to learn to be observant. And basically, the two things that a suburban, semi-rural kid learns. Well, the first thing that a suburban kid learns is how not to operate a lawnmower without losing your toes. That's pretty basic for a suburban kid. If you've ever mowed lawn, and you probably have, you know how to do it. One, wear protective shoes, and never put your foot under the thing. Never flip it over or mess with it. Try to unclog it, unless you've taken the spark plug off and disconnected the spark plug. Anyway, that's survival skill number one. Survival skill number two is how not to step on yellow jacket nests. I can tell you, and the answer is, of course, you have to just be aware of what's going on around you. You don't just blunder through the woods. You look ahead, and you notice, particularly since we were bug collectors, we tend to notice insects anyway. And this is a skill you don't lose in later life. And you basically know, if there are yellow jackets, you see them. And you look for if you see them coming in horizontally, like that, that's a landing pattern. You're over an airport. There must be a nest very close by. If they're flying along, well, no, they're flying along horizontally, then they're just minding their own business. But if they're coming in for vertical landings, particularly more than one of them, there's a nest there. Don't blunder into it. Have you ever read a story by Robert McCammon called Yellow Jacket Summer?
I have not.
You should.
I will.
You'll develop a phobia. I asked him. It's sort of like Jerry Bixby's "It's a Good Life" in a way. It's about a kid who terrorizes his town because he can control a yellow jacket. There is a scene in which somebody is. I remember somebody's in the. He's in the restroom in a gas station, and the lights are out. And when he turns the lights on, the entire ceiling is covered with yellow jackets. But and I remember asking McCammon, I said, well, why don't they just wait till winter until the yellow jackets die off and then kill the kid? And said that in Georgia, it doesn't work that way, that it's warm enough that the yellow jackets survive over winter. I mean, the worker yellow jacket survived, not just the queen. Well, yeah. Hey, you want to get more phobic? You know what European hornets are?
Sure.
Yeah, well, we occasionally see one in Pennsylvania. Then there's the Asiatic version, which is large, 3 times larger than that. Those are the ones of the murder, what they call murder hornets. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
extirpated from. Well, anyway, well, just imagine. Well, of course, people who live in the Orient are used to them every day, so they get used to it. And when I was in Italy once, I couldn't help but look and notice what insects were coming to the flowers and so on. And yeah, there were a lot of European hornets, just mind their own business. You got used to them. Basically, I gather what you do in say the south of France or somewhere is there are no picnics in like late August, early September, because the hornets will come for the food and they're a lot more aggressive. If you swat them away, they'll sting you a couple of times and then they'll come back for food. They have a very great sense of confidence. But anyway, so I don't think I have any really interesting phobias. You've got right down to it.
So correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, please. But I believe you became co-editor of Weird Tales in '87. How did that come about?
Well, yeah, John Betancourt convinced me and George Sithers that we were going to revive Weird Tales, and he was the one who managed to make it more than talk. Now George was an experienced editor. He had edited about Isaac Asimov's magazine and Amazing Stories, and I had worked with him on both. And John had worked with him on Amazing a little bit. John also apparently found somebody with some money, and so he made it real. I have to give him credit for that. And so we published Weird Tales. And for one point, I was under the delusion that we were all going to have a nice, secure living and do this for the rest of our lives and so on. But no. Ultimately, it became, like a 19, 20-year charity thing. Well, I have to, basically, we didn't get paid for this. Let's say I had, particularly once, somebody else took over, which Warren Lapine was the editor, was a publisher. He salvaged the magazine at one point after we went broke. I mean, you can read all about this in great detail. There's a book called The Weird Tales Story. It's the expanded version. It's originally by Robert Weinberg, but the expanded version is by Robert Weinberg and a bunch of other people. 6 chapters of that book are by me. One of them is a reminiscence of my years with Weird Tales. I will admit that I didn't actually get paid for this, and after a very short time, we stopped reimbursing ourselves for convention expenses and that sort of thing. And when I went around selling copies of the magazines, I turned all of the money into the company. So I wasn't taking a cut, but otherwise, I had my hand in the till, which is, well, for one thing, when Warren Lapine was paying for our business expenses, I was, let us say, embezzling toner. I actually started a small chapbook publishing company on the company copy machine. Zadok Allen Publisher, who is the name of the town. Do you go to Zadok Allen book around here? Basically, I started publishing chapbooks on the office copier. I also published the first version of the Innsmouth Tabernacle Choir hymnal that way. Started out with a book of it started out with. Okay, we digress slightly on. There's something else about publishing, real cheap publishing. My friend Jason Van Hollander got Cork Express, and he bragged that he could typeset a book in 45 minutes. Okay, let's do it. I timed it, and it took him an hour and 20 minutes. But the result was a book of limericks and other humorous poetry called Non-Compost Mantis. Compost is in compost heap. I printed up some copies. Yeah. Here's one of the most telling titles of the Zadok Allen line. Stop me before I do it again. And it has one of the characteristics of these is that it has it's on the back. It says a cascade of critical acclaim. Now, mind you, this is humorous Lovecraftian poetry, which is one of my other specialties, in which we have famous people giving me blurbs. Some of these are highly suspect, I dare say. It says, Darrell Schweitzer's merit as a poet is clearly demonstrated by this slender volume. Would that it were more so, Lord Dunsany. Poetry in the English language will never be the same, but then was it ever? Ezra Pound. I cannot believe that right now I could write a better poem than any of the ones contained in this book. Of course, I have been dead for 38 years, like I suspect. and, uh, and I'm glad I died before this came out, H.P. Lovecraft, and you're not going to get another blurb out of me shove off Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka, the first one had a blurb by Franz Kafka that made me feel insignificant. But anyway, the thing is that what actually happened, and we will attest to this because we did it at one of his New Year's parties. I printed up some copies, and I gave a few of them away to friends as party favors at the New Year's party. But by the end of the evening, I was up to my bad habits in selling them. I then ran off 250 copies, and the total expenses for doing this was $23, largely the paper, because I didn't have to pay for the toner, you see.
Right.
At that point, I realized I had a budget, and at this point, I could probably even afford to buy a long stapler. The true first edition of Non-Compost Mentis all have little creases in the back because you see I had to get into the gutter like this to staple them with a conventional stapler. I didn't have a long stapler. And anyway, I sold them all. 250 copies times $3 is $750.
Not bad.
Now, assuming there's a certain amount of wholesaling going on and deduct for postage, let's say the profit for this was close to $500. This is like printing money. Yeah, if you want to make money with poetry, humorous Lovecraftian verse is the way to go.
Great blurbs.
Great blurb. And it has a plausible imprint. Zadok Allen Publishers. Zadok Allen is the town drunk from the shadow of Innsmouth. And I said if he ever went into publishing, this is what he'd do. Later, I actually started to go to an actual printer and have him do the work. Because it worked out the cost was about, when I started to have to do it on my own copy machine and pay for the toner, it worked out that it was just, I could just readily go to a printer and have him do it and it would save me the work. But I published several of these and it became a legitimate small press publisher.
That's wild.
Because I published a few, there are non-Schweitzer titles in this line. There is the Fungi from Yuggoth by Morbius, the immortal Morbius Mortimer Momrath, who is an imaginary blatant imitator of H.P. Lovecraft, as invented by Joe Familia and Bill Wallace. There's a book of limericks by Paul Ganley. And also a book of the one prose title, The Sermon on the Mound and Others by Robert M. Price, which is his Cthulhu Prayer Breakfast sermons. Well, the late Jack Tucker, you may remember, did a book, a big encyclopedia of small press publishing. He said he would list me in there if I did hardcovers. Went to my buddy Robert Reginald of Borgo Press, who one of the things that Robert Reginald did a lot of was rebind his books in hardcover for the library trade. He largely published thin trade paperbacks, but he could rebind them in laminated boards for the library trade. And so I had him laminate and hardbind 10 copies of the first one. And that's a legitimate hardcover. They were first, well, some of them, the artist got 2, I got 2, 6 were for sale. There were 2 guys in France who somehow got in on the gag. So anyway, the result is and Barry Levin, a rare book dealer on the West Coast, is in on the gag. And so when you get right down to it, there were 3 copies for sale in the U.S. This is now one of the rarest of all limited editions in the entire history of our field. And the idea is that sooner or later, some collector is going to discover they're going to be tearing their hair out. And what is even the second one, called Poetica Dementia, had a hardcover unsigned edition. You see, the first one was a conventional signed limited edition, but for the second book, the limited numbered hardcover was not signed. The trade edition was, and the result is that every time, for all printings of the paperback edition of this, I have to sign them all because to maintain the integrity of the unsigned edition. Although I remember that Levin, the book dealer, just asked me to sign mine in his anyway. But anyway, so yeah, I have created some fiendishly rare collectibles that way.
Oh wow, that's genius.
Otherwise, the regular editions you can still get from me off on eBay and anything. But anyway, we were talking about Weird Tales, weren't we?
Yes.
Well, the
You
idea.
want to see a copy of it?
What?
Sure. If you have
Yeah,
it.
go find one. We'll go for. We will send my props man to get a copy. The original idea became our revival of Weird Tales, which is something I impressed upon the others, is that it was to be not a museum piece, not digging among old bones. Hey, here's one. There is the famous Thomas Ligotti issue with a cover by No, it's not. That's not what it is. This is our first issue.
Nice.
Our
Ramsey
revival.
Campbell.
Ramsey Campbell, Paul Wilson, Ted Klein, Kenneth Lee. This is the Gene Wolfe issue. There are like 6 stories by Gene Wolfe in here. Chet Williamson, and so on. And I'm present with, actually, I have a story in this, and I interviewed Gene Wolfe. And the entire issue is illustrated by George Barr, who very cleverly did pastiches of various other famous artists. So there's a George Barr, he does a Virgil Finlay, and then he does he does a Hans Bach and so on. It's really quite amazing. The idea was that it would be as if Weird Tales had died and gone to heaven. It was to look like Weird Tales as much as possible. And I emphasized that it should look like the Weird Tales of about 1940, which is actually not quite the golden age of Weird Tales, but it was when it had the best art. Because most of Weird Tales in the 20s and 30s is actually a pretty ugly magazine. Badly illustrated, badly laid out. But when it got sold to Short Stories Incorporated in 1939, suddenly they had a professional, regular pulp publishing company. They published a major magazine called Short Stories, which was the rival to Argosy and Blue Book, as one of the big 3 of the pulps. They had a professional art department. And also, the artists were getting better. They had Hans Bach and Virgil Finlay. And so I said, well, we'll make it look like Weird Tales of about late 30s, early 40s. But the content will be modern. In the same way that the Weird Tales of the 1930s was not a pastiche of 1880. We were not going to be a pastiche of 1930. And that is why this is a Gene Wolfe issue. And it's got all these other people who are still alive in it. And we published a Jonathan Carroll issue and a Thomas Ligotti issue. The idea of the special author issues, frankly, this was an imitation of the Stuart Schiff's very successful magazine Whispers. He would do, like he even did a Stephen King issue, but he would do issues of his magazine devoted to special famous authors, and then he'd do a signed limited edition of them, which would sell for incredible amounts of money. And our idea was, well, we'll do that, and then the signed limited edition will float the entire operation. The only problem is it didn't work. Eventually, we had to give up on the signed limiteds because I think we were victim of our own success. Because once the magazine is appearing regularly, then one more issue is not an event. Limited editions of every issue of, say, Analog, no one would care. So after a while, the hardcovers really stopped selling. And after a while, we also discovered we couldn't afford the book paper anymore. One thing I can be proud of is that the the earliest Terminus Weird Tales, the first 13 of them, in a pulp format on book paper. And they had print runs as high as 10,000 copies. These will be around for centuries.
Yeah.
Because the binding is actually pretty good. And the hardcovers are nice stone cloth bindings. They're very nice, but they're very durable. And we put enough of them out there that the magazine will not. Well, ours will. I guess you'd call it flea market immortality. There will always be copies of these issues in the used magazine market, and they won't be very expensive.
That's also great.
Except for the sign limited hardcovers. Some of those are expensive now. Of course, anything with Thomas Ligotti's name on it is plated in gold these days.
A lot of stories probably came across your desk when you were editor. But were you the editor when the Kamose stories by Keith Taylor were printed? I think I'm not sure how he pronounces it. That's my problem. Kamose. It was a Keith Taylor series.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I pronounce it Camos. I don't know if I'm right or not. But anyway, yes, these are the ones about the priest of Anubis.
Yes.
And hey, did you know there's a book of those?
Yeah, it's pretty recent, is it? Like a sort of recent collection?
Like for the last 5 years, it's wearing one of my other hats. I function occasionally as acquisitions editor for Iron Strock's fantastic books. And one of the things I talked him into doing was doing a book of Camo stories, which is called Servant of the something God. Do you have a copy of that book?
Is it Servant of the Jackal God? Is that what it is?
Yeah, Servant of the Jackal God. That's it. We need people to rush out and buy that book. It's quite wonderful. It's very little known, and oh, by the way, it's there is one subsequent Camo story that isn't in there because it's in an anthology of mine called That Is Not Dead, and which is I point out I do a whole series of anthologies for PS Publishing in England. This is one of them. This is not the one in question. That Is Not Dead was a historical Cthulhu mythos anthology. The premise was that, well, if the elder gods have been around since elder eons, someone should have noticed before Lovecraft's characters in the 1890s. Keith Taylor had once, well, no, actually, Keith Taylor didn't say it, but he wrote that Lovecraft made the comment somewhere that Nyarlathotep had appeared as a man in ancient Egypt. And so Keith Taylor wrote that story. But what happened with Kamos and Nyarlathotep met? And that's in a book of mine published in 2015 called That Is Not Dead. But yeah, we published those, and they were quite popular. Before that, he was largely writing Celtic things,
Like the Bard series.
the Bard series and other stories. He was one of our great regulars. In fact, when he was writing the Celtic things, it was safe to say that, well, he's probably the most Robert E. Howard-like writer we had. And so if you look at these, they talk about Lovecraft, Howard, and Clark Smith as the three musketeers of weird tales. Well, our three musketeers were Kenneth Lee, Thomas Ligotti, and Keith Taylor. We probably published more of Kenneth Lee than anyone else.
I love Keith Taylor's writing.
Yeah. And, well, you need to discover Kenneth Lee if you haven't.
I have a few books by Kenneth Lee. The Flat Earth,
Yeah.
Tales of the Flat Earth. I have a DMR collection of that one.
Hey, by the way, we were talking about book prices earlier. Those are very valuable. The book club, that 2-volume book club set, probably over $100. You don't expect that from used book club editions, but they're apparently not widely available now, and those are getting expensive.
Yeah.
So if you find one in your church rummage sale for 25 cents, buy it, put it on eBay for $75. She's a wonderful short story writer. Place to start is probably her. She had an Arkham House collection of the best of Kenneth Lee, title which is now escaping me. You can look it up. Kenneth Lee, Arkham House, something light and shadow, I think. Anyway, it's from the Jim Turner era of Arkham House. And it's a wonderful book.
Darrell, I wanted to talk about your writing a little bit. My personal favorite collection of yours, which I have here. I don't know.
Oh, yes.
We Are All Legends.
You got the first edition. You got the Wild Side.
Yeah, this is the Wild Side, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. Which has the stupid blurbs removed. It originally said it's across the top Balrog Award nominee writer. The coveted Balrog Award was something of a joke. It was true. One of the stories, among the 25 other things, had been nominated for a Balrog Award. Hank Stein, the editor, insisted that all of his authors in the Starblaze line had to be award nominees or winners of some sort, and they didn't even care what award, because this wasn't for the benefit of the fans. It was to make the buyers at Barnes & Noble order more copies, or that was the theory behind it. On the back cover, it had a blurb that said, comparisons to Le Guin are inevitable, and then it said SF News. and Le Guin was misspelled. And it was a lowercase g. But anyway, what that actually was a review of an Australian anthology in which one of the stories had appeared, in which the story called Into the Dark Land appeared. And the reviewer said that because of the subject matter, because it was about a descendant of the land of the dead, that because of the subject matter, comparisons to Le Guin are inevitable. However, Schweitzer's virtue is that it has nothing to do with it whatsoever to do with it. Completely original. And this got, sort of translated into, and they didn't want to say Australian SF news because that's too far away. So it says, comparisons of Le Guin are inevitable SF news. The wonders of blurbs. Well, the wonders of Photoshop are such that when John Betancourt did the new edition, you have the hardcover or the paperback?
Paperback.
Okay, the paperback says World Fantasy Award nominee at their top.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's actually true. I was the World Fantasy Award nominee 4 times. And it actually amounts to, I mean, I was a genuine Balrog nominee once, and as I remember, Pat Cadigan won that year, but that one didn't impress people a whole lot. But World Fantasy Award nominee is a little better. And the dumb blurb on the back cover was removed. Yes, this was my first fiction book. And it still has, I have spent the last 40 years correcting a couple of typos in it. So if you didn't buy this copy from me, turn to page 95.
95.
Where it says, the blurb at the bottom, I'm not the verse at the bottom, it says, from my men drink mead.
Yeah.
Me. The Y should be an E. And then turn to page 140. I obsessively correct these. And first line of the second paragraph, it says, on the fourth side, it should say on the fourth night. I tried to get this corrected, but Betancourt said when he reprinted this as a facsimile, he said he couldn't make corrections because he was doing it in facsimile. And I said, no, what we do is we Xerox the word night from elsewhere in the page, cut it out, paste it over, and of course doing an E over a Y would be very easy. You're gonna photograph it anyway, and therefore it will come out. But no, he didn't do that. But anyway, what has happened with this book is that I've gained my Warholian 15 minutes of fame with it. Somebody suddenly I started getting a lot of orders for this book and didn't know why. And then I figured out that somebody on YouTube had given it this glowing review, which is still there. Apparently there are not 2 of them. And somebody out there has decided that on the basis of this book written in the 1970s, I am or was a genius. And therefore, I'm in the position of like Arthur Machen, who, 40 years after he'd written The Three Impostors and The Great God Pan, was suddenly famous for them. But anyway, so this is the early Schweitzer. The pieces of it were published in various, mostly fairly obscure publications. I think a fair evaluation was, I never actually got one of these stories into an American magazine. I got them into a couple of Australian magazines, and I got a couple of them into American anthologies, into Andy Offleck's Swords Against Darkness series.
Yeah.
And one of them was even in the year's best horror, edited by Gerald Page. But what I would actually say, what you probably have to say about this book is it was ahead of its time, but not so brilliantly written as to dazzle people. So therefore, it took a while for anybody to appreciate it.
I wanted to ask you, because, in the introduction, Sprague de Camp mentions that you told him yourself that the Seventh Seal was a major influence.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Think of this book as the Seventh Seal meets the Travels of John Mandeville. And if you don't know, John Mandeville was a late medieval writer who wrote a book called The Voyages and Travels of John Mandeville. He's roughly a contemporary of Chaucer. And he wrote a book which, at the time, people put it on the same shelf with the Travels of Marco Polo, except that Mandeville had never been anywhere. He made it all up. As far as he knows, he was probably French. No, he may never have left France. But anyway, he made it all up. And there is indeed at least one thing, the story of the Veiled Pool of Mistorak in here has elements lifted straight out of Mandeville.
That's my favorite story.
Yeah, the Pool of Mistorak is described in John, but he also talked, there's a land of awful shadow somewhere in the Far East. It's right near to the terrestrial paradise. You get across Asia far enough, you get right next to the terrestrial paradise, and there are things like rivers that flow with rubies, and of course he describes all of the standard things about, people who, or, tribes of people who have no heads and have their, faces in their chests, and, a tribe of people who have enormous feet that they use as umbrellas and this kind of stuff. And if you are a connoisseur of ancient hearsay, this all only comes, this stuff got into medieval legend, and many people thought it was true. It comes from at least the earliest source I know of, is a Greek writer named Ctesias, who was a contemporary of Alexander the Great, who wrote of the explorations of India, and he sort of, let us say, embellished it a bit. And then other writers subsequently copied all this stuff, and it went on over the centuries, copying all this nonsense about what was beyond the map. I guess the crux of the book is here's a man who has effectively bartered his soul to the devil, and this is the only decent thing he ever did in his life. Actually, it was the only time he ever lived up to the code of chivalry and rescued a lady in distress in the first story, and so on. He did all the things that a chivalrous knight is supposed to do, but we sort of fell out with God in the meantime. And having fallen out with God and having things played out so badly, this is why he has supernatural adventures that other people don't, because he has a very, very different view of things. You may remember that scene in The Seventh Seal in which the knight asks, he asks a witch, have you seen the devil? And she says, why? She says, I want to talk to him about God. And the idea, that you would have to dig in dark places for what they're not telling you. And then most of what they are telling you may not be so.
The reason I like this collection so much is because obviously I read a lot of sword and sorcery, but it's not your standard, barbarian trope thing. It's just having it be a knight who is shunned by God and sells a soul to the devil it's a different take on things. It's a breath of fresh air.
With things, it falls into the accursed wanderer genre, like Melmoth the Wanderer and so on. Well, didn't you always wonder why Conan is always depicted as wearing this fur jockstrap and enormous boots and not much else? This makes no sense. At least when Robert E. Howard described Conan in the Median Chronicles, he talks about him trampling kingdoms under his sandaled foot. Those boots make no sense. I think he takes them off every once in a while and kills his enemies by the smell. There's also the practical matter that if you're anybody who goes into battle, like a typical sword and sorcery hero, nearly naked but for a broadsword, has either stolen that sword or is an exhibitionistic lunatic, a very short-lived one. The reason is, of course, is that any culture that can produce a broadsword will produce armor. No one in their right mind, well, the ancient Celts used to do this. They used to sometimes go into battle naked or nearly so, possibly because they were too impoverished. And if the guy has, if you only own one shirt, you take it off before you go into battle. But the Romans cut them to little pieces that way for that, because they fought as a team and they were wearing armor. So a lot of your typical sword and sorcery tropes don't make any sense. And if you want your character to be a barbarian, you should understand what that actually means. DeCamp points out that, there's an article that DeCamp once wrote called "Barbarians I Have Met," and he was talking about people he had met who were basically about one generation away from being what we would call barbarians. None of them are at all like Conan. I think one was an American Indian who Craig met, and he actually apparently did a little bit of sort of lumberjacking in his youth in upstate New York, and he met some pretty primitive people. And he also talked about somebody he met in Uganda, who he said was basically a easygoing patriarchal sort of fellow. And then there was an obnoxious Arabic guide he met. None of these had anything to do with Conan. The closest things to Conan in real life are usually people who are at least trying to be civilized. Harold Hardrada, you know who that is?
Yeah.
He has his very own saga. He's probably the closest thing to a real life Conan. He's a Viking who served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, and all of them got killed trying to conquer England. But he was a king, and needless to say, he didn't run into battle in a loincloth. He wore his armor like a sensible fellow. How he lived that long. Or Maximin the Thracian is another example. Maximin the Thracian was this giant. He really was a Conan type. He was a man who was about 7 feet tall and of enormous physical strength. And he was so impressive that he was hired to basically be the training sergeant in the Roman army. And eventually, when they had a particularly wimpy emperor they decided they wanted to get rid of, basically, Emperor Severus Alexander was a mama's boy, and he at one point wanted to, his mother at least, wanted to apparently cut the troops' pay so she could pay off the Germans so they wouldn't have to fight. Well, the army decided they wanted somebody a bit more macho, and they got Maximin, who had probably trained most of them, because he was, the drill sergeant of the German Front Roman Army, and was this huge, muscular, incredibly brave, incredibly powerful guy who's just the kind of guy that soldiers would want as their emperor. Now, what Robert Howard makes it quite clear that getting the crown doesn't mean you're going to live happily ever after. When Conan is king, anybody ever does is plot against him. Howard didn't quite get what happened to Maximin was, of course, the senatorial class totally rejected him because he was a barbarian. He wasn't a gentleman, and they proceeded to put up their own emperors. And basically, in the year 238, there were 7 emperors in 1 year. They came in batches, and when it was all over, they had a 13-year-old boy who was the only one left alive. But Maximin didn't make it because the Senate put up 2 emperors to get rid of him, and then they succeeded. But then they ended up getting done in by the Praetorian Guard. But anyway, the point is that you sort of get this in say Conan the Conqueror or Hour of the Dragon, with the original title. Conan is not going to be accepted by all of the aristocracy. He's going to be accepted by part of the military class, and it's always going to be a problem. There is also King Cole has the same problem, but there's also the logic problem that you have in any sword and sorcery series, that once your character is pinned and crowned, which is the way Lynn Carter used to describe it, once your character has become king, what do you do for a plot? Edgar Rice Burroughs rather implausibly would have John Carter as Warlord of Mars go off by himself and have an adventure. But no, that's not what really happens. Once the guy's a king, there's a bureaucracy around him, and he's never alone, and he spends much of the time at his desk signing papers. We do see that Conan gets kind of bored about this. And therefore, the only thing you can do as a plot, once your character has become king, is have people try to overthrow him, which is exactly what happens in the Hour of the Dragon, and also exactly what happens in the Scarlet Citadel. And that's about all that Robert Howard wrote about Conan as king. He suddenly had this insight which he didn't have when he wrote King Cole. One reason the King Cole series basically didn't go anywhere is that the Conan's adventures becoming king were much more interesting than what happened to him after he became king. So he, of course, scaled it all the way back to when Conan is a teenager and a young thug in, the Tower of the Elephant. And then he can plug in any number of adventures where Conan can be alone and can be in danger and so on, and not necessarily have a vast bureaucracy of clerks behind him.
The journey is always more interesting than the destination.
Well, much of the time. But the dramatic possibilities for what happens after the character becomes king are a bit limited. In the Edgar Rice Burroughs books, somebody would always kidnap a princess. Princesses disappear like crazy on Barstool. Tracking devices to keep track of them. But hey, I don't know if you were an Edgar Rice Burroughs fan, but
yeah, I have a couple collections.
I have a pretty decent Edgar Rice Burroughs collection, but if you go back and read them now, they're still very entertaining. I find he's the fastest reading writer I know. Just greased words. It's very readable prose, and it doesn't exactly make you stop and think. Burroughs once said that the secret of success in popular fiction is don't make the reader think. It also is weird to the point of surrealism at times. Burroughs isn't thinking either. My favorite example is in The Gods of Mars, which, as you may remember, The Gods of Mars opens up with about a 60-page sword fight. In the midst of this 60-page sword fight, the Black Pirates of Barsoom show up. So now it's a 3-way 60-page sword fight. And at one point, John Carter, basically, one of those flying vessels comes along, and there's a ladder dangling over the side. John Carter's on the top of a mountain or a cliff, grabs that ladder, he climbs aboard. He encounters one guy at the railing, whom he promptly throws over his shoulder to his death, of course. This is actually, this scene is, if you have any early editions, this is a scene that they use for the frontispiece. But then he gets aboard the flying ship, and the crew is asleep in the middle of a battle. That will probably explain why they lost. There's also a princess to be rescued, although she turned out to be a bad girl later in the plot. But if you stop and think about this even for half a second, this makes no sense whatsoever.
It doesn't.
Can you imagine Hornblower doing that in the Battle of Trafalgar? Climbs aboard a French ship of the line and discovers the entire crew is asleep. It takes the thing, and that would explain why the French lost. But also, we've got to admit the scene with the professors and the lion on the beach in Tarzan of the Apes is worthy of the Three Stooges. Despite which, there's still some Burroughs is better than others. So I will tell you, Beyond the Farthest Star is very disappointing, very unimaginative, very disappointing. I can understand why he wasn't even able to sell the second novelette.
Darrell, I wanted to ask you. You've been working in publishing and writing for a long time. Did you ever have any run-ins with Carl Edward Wagner?
I met him a couple of times.
Okay.
We got him. I can tell you. Well, two things. One is when Jerry Page quit the job of editing Year's Best Horror, I applied for it. So did Carl Wagner. I can really say the best man won. He did a better job than I could have, and he certainly was better connected and so on. It was a wise choice on the part of Dodd to make Carl the editor. Otherwise, I saw him at conventions on occasion, and we did do a Carl Edward Wagner issue of Weird Tales, you may recall. Unfortunately, Carl was well into his self-destructive downward spiral by then. That's about the last thing he ever wrote. And John Betancourt had to, maybe he had the manuscript. We were at a World Fantasy Convention in Nashville in 1987. And John Betancourt had basically had to follow Carl around, who had the manuscript with him, and he was still scribbling revisions on it. And I think he had to buy him more drinks or something. He followed him around much of the weekends. They finally got the manuscript away from him. And then we were able to transcribe and publish it. And that was about the last thing Carl ever published. So I cannot say I knew him well.
Okay.
I certainly do remember him as a contemporary figure. And I certainly met him a few times. I never interviewed him, unfortunately.
His Kane stories are some of my personal favorite.
Yeah. I have to admit that I've actually always preferred his horror stories.
Yeah, they're good as well, yeah.
And he was a writer I first discovered in the pages of Whispers magazine. When Styx was published, I think the third issue. I had been in the second issue. One of my first respectable publications was the second issue of Whispers. And then Stuart Schiff accepted one other story of mine, and it took him 14 years to publish it.
14 years.
Well, the reason he kept trying to give it back to me. And I said, no, take your time, publish, you publish it whenever you can. One of them was to give it back to me. And what I understand why is when the magazine was just starting, well, he got what he got. It was excellent from the start, but he got what he got. But once he had gotten to the level where he was publishing original novellas like Fritz Leiber, and he was publishing original Carl Edward Wagner, and David Drake was turning into a really interesting writer, and there are a lot of big names. I don't know how familiar you are with Whispers magazine.
Not too familiar. I've heard of it, though.
Well, my friend Lee had one story in it. I'm very jealous. Because he sold the Whispers later than I did. But anyway, what it was basically clear was that Whispers was not just any small press magazine. It was going to be something really spectacular. And once it was going to become really spectacular, Stuart Schiff did not need apprentice level work to meet. So I understood that while these, I was writing stories which were quite publishable, like some of the early We Are Legends material, but it wasn't good enough for Whispers. So I understood I was never going to be publishing Whispers again. So I really hung on, and basically I wore him down. And 14 years later, he actually did publish it. And that was my final appearance in Whispers. Lo and behold, no surprises there. Because by then he was doing Stephen King issues, and really, really big names and important writers were in there.
You mentioned a name earlier I have to ask about because when I've spoken to some of your contemporaries like Keith Taylor and Michael Moorcock, and I mentioned this name, I got negative responses. Made me self-conscious as a reader because I actually enjoy Lynn Carter's Thongor series, but Keith Taylor and Michael Moorcock were not fans of his writing.
We, we will forgive you. I think it might be you have to be 12 at the right time. I'm not a great admirer of Lynn Carter's writing either. Everybody liked Lynn. He was a great guy to hang out with. He was a wonderful raconteur. And one of the first things I learned from Lynn Carter, knowing Lynn Carter, was that a guy can be a great guy and he can be your friend and you can really find it really entertaining. His writing might be crap. The best people don't necessarily write the best material. And the people who write bad material can be great people. But basically, my view of Lynn Carter was, well, as somebody put it, the Valentine Adult Fantasy series was a lapse in tastelessness, as somebody put it. The Valentine Adult Fantasy series, educated an entire generation of fantasy writers into the potential of what could be done, and created the market as we now know it. Is tremendously important. He is as important to fantasy as John W. Campbell was for science fiction. But Lynn, as a writer, sometimes I can remember reading stories of his that read like a kid's, a story which he would include in his own anthology. I will, as an aside, I have no objection to a writer-editor including his own work in an anthology or magazine. Michael Moorcock wrote whole issues of New World sometimes, practically. Frederick Pohl used to serialize his own novels in Galaxy. No problem. I published some work in my own Weird Tales, although my colleagues had to buy it. See, I was never sole editor. So it was always some kind of bounty. Other people had to agree, and they could say no. But Lynn Carter put in his own work in the year's best fantasy. That's the line you don't cross.
Yeah.
Judging yourself as the year's best. Because not only I'm also in a magazine, of course, there's always the next, you're not pushing somebody else out to make room for yourself. Because there's always another issue. A magazine, as long as it is open-ended, never runs out of space. But anyway, I can remember reading a Lynn Carter story in one of his own anthologies. It read sort of like a child's scrapbook. Well, that's a scene from The Dying Earth, and this is from that Robert E. Howard story. It was like he'd taken all these pieces of various stories and just, cut them out and put them together with no creativity there. I think he basically was he was somebody who truly loved fantasy, devoted his life to it, but he never really quite got out of the fan stage, and he never found his own voice.
Yeah.
Though I admit I haven't read some of his later. I know he was writing these very sexy books toward the end. Terra of the Twilight. He was basically trying to do John Norman at that point. Only maybe he's a little more imaginative than John Norman. And I can remember he gave a complimentary copy of one of these to the DeCamps. And Catherine DeCamp said very stiffly, well, we couldn't keep that one. And
Poor Lynn.
Poor Lynn. He used to talk about learning to grow and expand as a writer, and so he could learn to, quote, do other writers. He could do Robert E. Howard, he could do Edgar Rice Burroughs, he learned to do Lee Brackett, he could do Van Vogt, and he was learning to do John Norman. But what he didn't actually do was learn how to do Lynn Carter.
Yeah.
What about the Chimerium? Yeah, Lee asked me, what about the Chimerium? Well, that's because he never wrote it. He just talked about it. He went through his whole...
There were some pieces.
Yeah, little bitty pieces. I think you put the whole thing together, it's like 30 pages long. It was supposed to be this magnum opus that Lynn would always talk about, this great thing he was going to write. It wasn't going to be just one more hack fantasy novel. He admitted a lot of his books were just sort of commercial product. But he was going to write this great epic, which is going to be like an encyclopedia set. And he said that, well, like one chapter would be biographies of all the kings, and it'd be sort of like Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars. And there would be like an entire volume about the plant life in this imaginary world. It was going to be this vast, extravagant thing that would make, something like Austin Tappan Wright's Islandia look, commercial and restrained. There's only one problem: it was all talk. He never did it. Writers who talk a great deal about what they're going to write often don't do it
Yeah.
because they expend the energy talking about it and then never actually write it. And so this great masterpiece that he wanted us to believe that he was working on, we never saw more than a few very, very small fragments of it.
Would you consider yourself friends with Lynn?
In a casual way, in a convention friend. More, I think,
Okay.
more than anything else, I was basically a member of his audience. He used to gather people he knew around, and he'd start expounding and telling wonderful stories, and also a good deal of bullshit. Uh, and so I was, it was one of his faithful listeners. I will tell you that I submitted a story to him for the Valentine Adult Fantasy series, hoping he would do another anthology, and he accepted it. But he never published the anthology. Never happened. And after about 3 years, I asked him what he could do with his story, and he just gave it back to me. And that's the story I have in Whispers #2. And that was a story I wrote when I was 19. It was published when I was 21. As close as I ever came to being a prodigy. And it's close as it's close as I ever came to being part of the Valentine Adult Fantasy series. If it had gone on for a couple more years and there had been another anthology in the series, I would have been in it.
Darrell, I'm not going to keep you off for all night here. Just to wind down with these last couple. What would you say is the best writing advice that you've received, and who gave it to you?
Well, Spread de Camp says that the secret of most writing is the application of the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. Well, the best writing advice I could give anybody is don't quit your day job. And I used to teach a writing course, and I would run the numbers out for them. And I would run the numbers out in a way that, probably in more prosperous era than now. If you, let us suppose, you are the envy of your writing workshop, and people would sell their souls to be where you are, and you sell 5 stories to, let us say, Asimov in 1 year. And let us say, for purposes of easy calculation, they're 5,000 word stories, and they pay 8 cents a word. You're making $400 a story. You've just made $2,000 selling short fiction. And let us suppose in the same year, you are very successful and you sell a novel for, let us say, 4 books, for a typical first novel of advance of, let us say, $4,000. That's generous. You've just made $6,000 in a year. You're a roaring success. Do factor in your medical benefits. Basically, the only time you ever go full time as a writer, which I have never done, is when you realize that you are losing money by not writing. There are some writers who regard it very strictly as a form of income and as a business. And I guess the writer in question is dead, but I guess I won't mention him anyway. But there was a quite prominent short and sorcery writer, among other things, a writer who I once asked to be in one of my anthologies. And he said, no, he would need $5,000 to write a short story.
Wow.
And I said, I understood. He said, you understand I can't do this, but as we are men of the world, why don't you explain to me why you have that price? And he said that he has all the book contracts he could possibly want and could possibly fulfill, and he makes about $50,000 a book. And a short story takes about a tenth as much time as writing a novel. Therefore, if he got less than $5,000 for it, he would be losing money. You have to admit that his logic is impeccable.
Yeah, can't argue with him.
But if that's how you see your writing, that's how you see it. But basically, and I won't say he didn't consider himself an artist, but he also saw himself as a businessman. William Shakespeare probably said, "Well, I don't write plays for cheap." And there's a lot of writers figure that they have to keep the price up. Now, I would have to say that I've never reached the point where I could really do that kind of hardball negotiating, that you must pay me this or else. So don't quit your day job.
Good advice.
It's more like being a poet. Although, of course, if you publish short booklets of humorous Lovecraftian verse, you can make money as a poet. Although it's probably not. Other thing, well, let me see. Everybody should rush out. Well, they should rush out and buy a copy of the Children of Chorazin, my most recent collection. You need one of those, which might be described as, at least some of its contents, as sort of Pennsylvania Lovecraftian folk horror. You should also read my novel, The Mask of a Sorcerer.
Another great story.
That's
Yes.
the best one. I have a sense of I've been writing the same novel over and over again, but that's the best version of it. In my most sustained performance. And everybody needs to read that one.
And by we are all legends.
And by we're all legends, well, buy everything, you know. I have 14 short story collections out. You need to buy, I mean, I have many distinctions that I'm sure you didn't know about. Like, for example, I am in my collection, Nightscapes, you'll find a story called Kvetula. Kvetula is surely the leading Jewish vampire story ever written by a Gentile. It's about and it has there's a sequel called Kvetula's Daughter, which is as yet uncollected. I remember Tanith Lee read it, and I didn't know that Tanith Lee was Jewish, but she was, and she said found it really. And she said she found this one absolutely terrifying. It's about a Jewish mother vampire. Well, basically, it's about a Jewish mother whose her husband is the nerdy vampire Dracula fan, and who books them on a tour of Transylvania. Well, in the course of things, they get turned into vampires. It doesn't improve her disposition one bit. She's always complaining about everything. You know, the coffins are too cramped. The gypsy tell lousy jokes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She complains her way all the way up to Dracula himself, who sends her home in a coffin nailed shut with silver nails by Romanian Express or something. Anyway, and this is all told it's all told in her voice, not quite dialect, but my wife is Jewish, and she managed to make sure that it sounded like her relatives. There were only one or two phrases she thought needed to be changed, because realistically, anybody who's grown up in the eastern United States, particularly Philadelphia or New York, and has listened to Woody Allen, who's listened to Lenny Bruce, and all those, can do Jewish complaint humor, whether they're Jewish or not. And if my 84-year-old Jewish mother-in-law described it as funny as hell, that's all the affirmation I need.
Agreed.
But I know my limitations. If somebody were to say make a TV series out of that, they would need to get more authentic writers than me because I could only go so far before I would exhaust what I knew. I would have to have a staff of genuine Jewish humorists now, because I can only keep going so far. So 2 stories was enough. I also wrote the world's only alternate historical vampire cat detective story.
What's that one called?
It's called The Adventure of the Hanoverian Vampires. It's in a couple of my collections. We should also mention that PS Publishing has done a 2-volume set of the best of Darrell Schweitzer. There's a career retrospective. The volumes are The Mysteries of the Faceless King and The Last Heretic. But for years, about the time Mike Resnick came out with Alternate Kennedys as an anthology, I started to joke on panels that alternate historical vampire cats was only a matter of time. And so ultimately, I rose to the challenge and wrote one. And it was published to great pride of place. It's in a book called, originally, it's been reprinted several times, but it was originally in a book called called Crafty Cat Crimes, which is one of those Barnes and Noble omnibus things you find on remainder tables. Martin Greenberg, Stefan Jimenowitz, and Robert Weinberg. And they put it as the first story in the book, so they must have been really proud of it. And it's a story about Sherlock Holmes's cat, or a cat which has adopted Sherlock Holmes, because cats are not owned, they're merely entertained.
Right.
Sherlock Holmes's cat versus Dracula's cat, and a plot to import vampires into England to overthrow the Stuarts. It was reprinted in Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine once. It's in my collection, Deadly Things, which is my ostensible mystery collection. And it's also in The Last Heretic from PS Publishing. That's what you should do. Buy the 2-volume set from PS Publishing, and it's in there. Because there I know it's typographically perfect. I think there are typos in a couple of the other versions. But anyway, so yes, it really did, touch all those bases. And now a publisher has told me that he's going to let me actually do the anthology. He hasn't gotten to it yet, but he still has it on the back burner that we're actually going to do an anthology called Alternate Historical Vampire Cat Detectives. And it will be an anthology of basically cross-genre stories, preferably humorous ones. The basic requirement was you have to cross at least two genre boundaries. So if you have a science fiction Western romance, that will work, or what as we say we'll think of some other absurd possibilities. A zombie espionage coming of age story. Okay.
There you go.
There you go. But the thing is that I would actually have to reprint my own, because I've definitely written the definitive alternate historical vampire cat detective story. And it's only about 2,500 words long too. So you can go get a copy of Crafty Cat Crimes, which is this like 300, 400 page book of cat fantasy stories. My wife has a story in that one too. Hers is about the Cheshire Cat, and it involves the Cheshire Cat and the theft of the Alice in Wonderland manuscript and this sort of thing. Yes, I am quite capable of being silly at times, although of course I'm obviously a deeply sincere and artistic writer. But I will point out that I guess my real claim to fame is that I rhymed Cthulhu in limerick. Because a cultist entranced with Cthulhu encountered a slavering ghoul who said, "Old ones don't need me, they won't even feed me, and so in a pinch I guess you'll do." George Simmons actually published that in Amazing Stories. Yeah, Hugo Gernsback was spinning in his grave at that point. And, oh yes, I am also a limericist of some note.
I can tell.
I rewrote. I was once on a panel at a convention in Boston, at a World Con in Boston, and we were talking about. I think we were in fact talking about the Lord of the Rings. Yeah, I think it was some kind of Tolkien panel, and I did my curmudgeonly thing and said, well, it's all padding. I could rewrite the whole Lord of the Rings into a limerick, and of course, then I had to. Now I had to do it. Unlike the late Isaac Asimov, who I also knew somewhat, Isaac Asimov spoke fluent limerick. He would have just done it off the cuff. But you see, my spontaneous wit takes a certain amount of practice. And therefore, what I had to do, I take down my the sign with my name on it, which is on the on the table in front of me, the little cardboard sign they put up, and I had scribbling on the back of this while we were conducting the panel. I was carrying on the conversation, but I was also scribbling on the back of my sign. And about 30 minutes later, I said, "Okay, people, I got it." Which is, so Bilbo gives Frodo this ring. There's a quest to destroy the damn thing. At the lip of Mount Doom, there's a question of whom they should rescue, shove in, or fling. So that is the Lord of the Rings is the limit.
You don't need to read that long thing now.
Well, actually you should, because among other things, when you look at a lot of modern fantasies, you read like Robert Jordan or Brandon Sanderson, you realize what a fair and compact writer Tolkien really was. You could put the entire Lord of the Rings inside one Brandon Sanderson volume, and
you really
and
could.
the Silmarillion too, and it would still rattle. 1,000 pages of tiny pen,
I like to end with this question here, because you just never know what people are going to say, and I got quite a few ghost stories from Michael Moorcock. So have you ever had an experience that you would consider supernatural, paranormal, or an encountered event you can't explain?
No.
There you go. All right.
No, I'm pretty much of a mechanistic materialist like H.P. Lovecraft.
Michael Moorcock said he saw a few ghosts here and there and saw a suit of armor animate. So I always ask the question because you never know what someone could say. You
never know. But no, I have never seen anything like that. I stood next to Henry VIII's armor once, and it didn't. I have a photograph of me standing next to Henry VIII's armor, and she's in the Tower of London, and I am shoulder high to him, and I'm 5'11", but he was a big guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I can also tell you the royal codpiece was like half a watermelon.
Oh man!
Either he was very insecure, or the Majesty of England required a certain amount of protection.
Well, Darrell, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. I,
Okay.
I appreciate it, and thank you again, Lee, for setting this up. And
Welcome.
if you have anything else you'd like to show and tell right now, now would be the time. If you got any more books around or anything you're trying to sell.
Well, I think you also people ought to go. Well, they ought to go find me on eBay and just search on my name. And when you search on my name on eBay, you'll very quickly find a listing that where I am clearly the seller. Then you go to other books by this seller, and then you search on my name, and you'll find just about everything.
There we go.
Because just about everything of mine is either in print or I still have copies. And then you can look me up on the Internet Speculative Fiction Database, and it goes on and on and on.
All right. We will do that, sir.
Accurate.
Thank you again, Darrell. I appreciate it. I had a great time chatting with you.